You're violating HOA policy.
You're violating HOA policy.
Hospital security is responding. You brought this on yourselves, said Verena Chalswick, president of our HOA board, standing 2 feet from my wife's contraction-stricken body, arms folded like this was a parking dispute and not an unfolding emergency. This is an unauthorized vehicle drop-off in a no-standing zone. Your HOA violations don't get suspended just because she's screaming. I blinked at her. Screaming? That was labor. My wife's face was white, her hand wrapped around my wrist, and her water had broken 5 minutes ago. The hospital's triage nurse was already calling for a gurney when the security radio on Verena's hip crackled again. She'd called the HOA's private patrol, and they'd followed us here. You realize this is a hospital, I said evenly, and that interfering with patient access can trigger federal compliance violations under EMTALA. Her smug smile cracked for half a second. Before I go any further, subscribe now if you believe HOA abuse needs national exposure. If this has ever happened to someone in your community, drop your city below. My name is Callan Mirek, I said. I'm the Director of Risk and Compliance for the hospital system you just trespassed into. And that access lane you're whining about, I helped design its emergency egress logic, which still works, by the way, despite your interference. Elena winced beside me, trying to breathe through the next wave. I shifted to support her back as 2 nurses finally reached us. One glanced at Verena's ID badge and flinched. This is not just about a car, I muttered, low enough only Elena could hear. It's about control. It had started a week earlier, when I parked for 6 minutes. 6, next to the emergency access marker at the bottom of our sloped driveway in Glade Cross Summit. I'd needed to carry Elena's overnight hospital bag down to the car, then come back for her. She was 39 weeks along, and walking had started to trigger cramping. Our street is narrow, the kind where HOA painted curbs wrap around landscaped boulders like sacred property lines. One of those boulders is stamped with, "No stopping anytime. Emergency access. HOA enforced." 3 hours later, I got a violation notice via the Glade Cross app. Attached, a screenshot from Verena's Ring camera, captioned, "Unauthorized prolonged obstruction of emergency lane." I remember staring at the screen like it had personally insulted me. Elena had just finished sobbing from a Braxton Hicks scare. I hadn't even told her about the violation yet. We bought this home after 3 failed IVF attempts. After a doctor told us the odds of conception had dropped below 5%, after I sold my late brother's land to afford the last round. Elena had named the baby already, Lyra, after a constellation she used to trace during our first round of ultrasounds. Every inch of this house was meant to protect that life. Every dollar was hard fought. Every minute of peace was earned. So when the HOA flagged us like we were teenagers double parking in a fire zone, I knew it wasn't just bureaucracy. It was Verena Chalswick again. Last year, she tried to fine a man across the street for having a wheelchair ramp that didn't match the approved neighborhood slope aesthetics. She'd been building her control case for months, using our homes like puzzle pieces in her personal simulation. But now, she'd followed us to the hospital. Elena groaned beside me again. A nurse snapped her fingers and shouted, "Gurney, now!" I turned my head to Verena one last time. "You think your HOA authority means something here?" I said. "You've crossed into a federally regulated medical facility. You're not just violating decency anymore. You're breaking the law." Security stepped in. The nurse whispered something into a nearby phone, and that was the moment Verena finally stepped back, just 2 inches. Not because she was afraid, but because she realized, for the first time, she might actually lose. The next morning, the violation email came in again. This time, it had a bolded header. Second notice, Neighborhood Code 4.6b, unauthorized emergency obstruction. There was an updated timestamp and a still image, me, holding Elena's waist, just before lifting her into the car. The picture was framed so tightly it looked staged. The background had been blurred. Only the yellow curb line and my knee against the SUV door were in focus. They made it look like I was lounging next to a fire lane. Glade Cross Summit had always been a rule-heavy neighborhood, but it didn't start like this. The welcome brochure used to say, "Highlands with Heart." That was before Verena Chalswick won her second term as HOA president, before she rewrote the enforcement policy to give the board full camera access from volunteer participants, which meant people like her could use their doorbell footage as evidence, anonymously or not. Her street had 6 participants. Mine had none. It wasn't just about parking. Last year, she fined a father for hanging a red swing on a birch tree, called it unapproved structural deviation. The year before, she claimed a garden flag with a rainbow was a potential provocation under community tone guidelines. When he challenged it, she had the board revoke his patio variance. People didn't speak out. They whispered. The emergency access boulder, our version of a warning sign, sits at the bottom of Alderwick Curve, right where 3 lots dip toward the community walking trail. It's been repainted 5 times in 2 years. Verena personally added the wording 24/7, no exemptions. She once told a neighbor that an ambulance could take an extra 6 seconds if residents got too sentimental. What she meant was, nothing interrupts order, not grief, not pregnancy, certainly not inconvenience. That boulder was where she first saw me break the rule. I'd been on my way down with Alina's bag when the message pinged. Contractions started. 4 minutes. I dropped the bag and sprinted back up the stairs. When I came back down carrying her, she was pale and shaking. I loaded her in and jumped into the driver's seat. 6 minutes. That was it. But someone, likely Verena, had time-stamped the moment we paused as 7:02:12 and filed it like a federal crime. When I tried to speak to her later that day, just to explain, she shut the door with a half-smile and said, "The board's decision is final once logged. I don't make exceptions for personal feelings." But now, it wasn't just our house. I'd heard from the Reddings 2 weeks ago. Their elderly mother's home care van was ticketed for parking on the slant near the clubhouse while she was helped inside. Then the Ruiz family, flagged for pausing too long by the hydrant while their teenage son recovered from knee surgery. Each time it was about visual harmony or safety enforcement. No one fought back because the complaints were filed just low enough to avoid triggering legal scrutiny. HOA enforcement, when done like that, felt more like erosion than attack. It wore people down until they bent or moved. But Glade Cross wasn't just where we lived, it was where we started over. After my brother died, Mark, the firefighter, he left me the deed to a strip of forest land upstate. I sold it to pay for our last round of IVF. Elena and I walked this neighborhood every evening while we waited on the results, mapping out which house we'd grow old in, which path we'd take Lyra on her first bike ride. Now I was getting HOA notices while my wife lay in a maternity ward recovering from induced labor triggered by stress. And Verena. She didn't even pause to ask if Elena was okay. She filed the second violation. She time-stamped it to the minute. And she added a warning. Further behavior may result in suspension of community privileges or legal action from the board. I stared at that line for a long time. I'd spent my life in hospital hallways, calculating risks before they happened, infection exposure zones, triage efficiency rates, access corridor flow during mass casualty events, but I'd never once imagined I'd have to run those equations to protect my wife from the very neighborhood we'd chosen to keep her safe. Verena thought the board was untouchable. She hadn't realized I'd spent 15 years teaching institutions how to collapse risk systems from the inside. She was about to find out. I met Reese Inderwell 2 days after Lyra was born. He didn't come to the hospital. He didn't send a message through the HOA app. He waited until I was alone, standing at the far end of the Glade Cross Summit parking loop, where the asphalt curves into the maintenance corridor behind the fire equipment shed. It was the one place in the neighborhood without cameras. That alone told me this wasn't a social call. He stood there longer than necessary, helmet tucked under his arm, eyes scanning the slope as if he expected someone to step out from behind the retaining wall. Reese had the kind of posture you only see in people who spend their lives anticipating disaster. Straight spine, weight balanced, always half ready to move. "Callan," he said finally, voice low, "I'm not here as HOA treasurer." I didn't answer right away. I watched him instead. I'd seen his name on the board roster for years. Quiet, efficient, always voted with the majority, but never spoke much during meetings. The kind of man who kept the books clean and his opinions locked behind professional restraint. "I'm here as fire marshal," he added, then hesitated, "and as someone who might have let something go too far." That pause mattered. We stood there with the sound of wind brushing through the hillside pines, the smell of hot rubber drifting from the service vehicles parked nearby. This was a neutral zone, whether he knew it or not. No one shouted here. No one postured. Things got said carefully. "I saw the report," he continued, "the one from the hospital incident. My jaw tightened. Then you know it shouldn't exist. I know, he said. And that's the problem. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, the gesture small but loaded. Verena logged the emergency access violation before your car even left the curb. She marked it as prolonged obstruction based on predictive duration. That made my stomach drop. Predictive enforcement wasn't just aggressive, it was improper. She assumed you'd be there longer, he went on. Words clipped now, professional instinct slipping through. And when the security vendor called her from the perimeter, she told them to continue observation beyond the property boundary. I looked at him sharply. That's not allowed. No, he agreed. It isn't. Reese exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath for days. Our contract with Mistwatch only authorizes enforcement within HOA-managed land. The moment they followed you to the hospital, they crossed a line. Legally, operationally, ethically. Then why didn't you stop it? The question came out quieter than I expected. He didn't flinch. That told me he'd already asked himself the same thing. Because I didn't see the full scope until after, he said. And because Verena doesn't like being challenged, especially by someone who carries a badge she doesn't control. There it was, the truth underneath the restraint. He shifted his weight, eyes briefly meeting mine before drifting away again. I've pushed back before. On smaller things. She files it away, waits. Then suddenly you're under review for budget discrepancies or procedural misalignment. I have a family too. I nodded once. I understood that calculus better than he knew. She's been tightening emergency access enforcement for months, Reese continued. Not for safety, for leverage. She knows those violations scare people. Medical emergencies don't leave room to argue back. The words landed hard, because they were true. I should have said something sooner, he added. When she added the no exemptions clause to the stone marker, when she repainted it herself, when she started time-stamping footage manually instead of relying on system logs. I felt something shift then. Not relief, not anger. Recognition. Reese wasn't here to confess out of guilt. He was here because his training had finally collided with his silence. What are you telling me? I asked. That you're not wrong, he said. And that what happened to your wife wasn't an accident. It was an escalation. He paused, then spoke more carefully. If this goes external, it won't just be an HOA issue. Emergency access violations fall under state review. Insurance carriers care about that. Regulators care about that. The wind picked up again, rattling the metal siding behind us. Somewhere up the hill, a garage door slammed. I can't lead this, Reese said quietly, but I won't stand in the way anymore. I met his eyes then, really met them. That was all I needed. Because systems don't collapse from rage. They collapse when the people holding them together finally stop pretending they're solid. 3 days after Elena was discharged, a certified letter arrived. The envelope was HOA standard, beige, gold logo embossed, just official enough to feel like it belonged in a courtroom. Inside was a printed notice stamped with the words, Final Escalation Warning, a third violation. This time, the phrasing had sharpened. Resident Callan Mirek has demonstrated an ongoing disregard for neighborhood safety infrastructure, including but not limited to repeated obstruction of emergency access zones, hostile interactions with security personnel, and failure to respond to corrective measures issued in accordance with Glade Cross Summit Bylaws Section 3.8a. They attached another image. This one showed my car's taillights at the hospital entrance. Cropped so tightly, the hospital sign wasn't visible, just the edge of the curb and the red line beneath the bumper. Verena had written a note on the side in pen. Violation confirmed by visual evidence. This wasn't negligence. This was war by formatting. The kicker came at the bottom. Pending a hearing of the Compliance Committee, community privileges including clubhouse access, event participation, and emergency amenity services may be temporarily suspended. Emergency amenity services. They meant snow plowing our part of the road, trash pickup, community medtech support, all things that could impact Alina and Lyra directly. I stared at the letter until the words blurred. When I looked up, Alina was in the doorway. She didn't say anything, just held Lyra close, her sweater half-buttoned, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, her body still healing, her trust in our neighborhood fraying. I stood and folded the letter slowly, not to delay but to calm my hands. Then I drove straight to the HOA office. The building sits at the north edge of Glade Cross Summit, a squat stone structure with a glass vestibule and 2 flagpoles that never seem to fly anything. Inside, the air always smells faintly of pine cleaner and tension. The receptionist was new, young, clearly uncomfortable when she saw my name on the visitor log. "She's in the boardroom," she whispered. I didn't knock. Verena looked up from her laptop like she'd been expecting applause, not confrontation. Her chair was angled slightly toward the window. A printed copy of my violation letter sat neatly in front of her, along with a spreadsheet that had my name highlighted in yellow. "Mr. Mirek," she said, feigning surprise, "here to appeal another emergency lane violation? I'm here because your vendor crossed a legal boundary." She tilted her head. "Our vendor was acting on instructions issued through proper channels. You parked in a restricted area again." "You mean the hospital drop-off zone?" She didn't blink. "Your vehicle was parked in a marked area. The timestamp indicates unauthorized duration. The location is immaterial to the enforcement policy." I stared at her. "You're enforcing HOA policy at a hospital?" "We enforce pattern behavior," she said calmly. "Not isolated incidents, and Glade Cross residents are expected to uphold neighborhood standards regardless of location." That sentence sat in the air like spilled bleach. I glanced at the spreadsheet. 6 names were highlighted. "You've flagged others too?" "That's not relevant to this discussion. It will be when the city sees it." Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. "You believe the city will intervene over a local matter?" she asked, now dropping the politeness. "I think they'll intervene when they find out your board authorized surveillance beyond HOA boundaries, misrepresented timestamps, and potentially interfered with emergency medical access, especially when that surveillance resulted in direct delay of care." "You're threatening me," she said flatly. "No," I said. "I'm telling you, I know exactly which agencies handle non-compliant HOA interference with emergency services, and I know which clause in your vendor contract you violated." Her mouth twitched at that, the first real crack. "Expect contact," I added, turning toward the door. "From people whose clipboards aren't decorative." She didn't stop me. Outside, the sky was turning steel gray, the kind of shade that made the Glade Cross curbs look sharper than usual, but I didn't feel the cold. Inside that building, Verena had just realized something. I wasn't the kind of homeowner who got buried under bylaws. I was the kind who knew exactly where to send subpoenas. The next morning, I was back at the hospital, not as a husband, not even as a resident under fire, but as the Director of Risk and Compliance. It was a title that didn't open every door, but it opened the ones that mattered right now. I didn't walk in with emotion. I walked in with evidence. My badge cleared the staff-only corridor that led to the legal liaison office. The assistant waved me through without a question. They knew what this was about. By now, everyone did. The story had spread across departments like wildfire. An HOA president's private security interfering with an active labor case, triggering an emergency security response. Most people thought it was rumor. A few nurses who'd been on shift that night knew otherwise. The liaison's office was sterile and sunless, tucked behind the compliance audit wing. Legal counsel hadn't arrived yet, but our operations documentation system had. I pulled up the incident report filed by the ER nurse, code flagged as external interference. There it was in black and white. Security delay due to non-staff obstruction of ambulance lane, involving third-party private security firm. Patient in active labor. Delay, checker 3 minutes, 47 seconds. I cross-checked it against our risk matrix protocol. Any interference over 180 seconds during patient intake triggered a red flag notification, a procedural benchmark we used for federal audit reviews. That's what cracked this wide open. Under Section 1317.1 of California Health and Safety Code, any interference with emergency medical services, especially during patient intake, could be submitted to the Department of Public Health and the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. And because this wasn't a patient family member or a rogue protester, this was a third-party contractor acting under HOA directive, it qualified as a non-permitted external agent. That gave me jurisdiction. I opened a case report through our internal incident system, attaching the photos, timestamps, and the second HOA violation letter. I flagged it for dual review, legal and external regulatory, then requested a short-form summary from Dr. Rennick, Elena's OB-GYN. I knew him well enough to ask directly. When he replied later that day, it wasn't short. He described the adrenaline spike Elena experienced, how her contractions irregularized under the added stress, how her breathing faltered after the confrontation. He called it preventable stress-induced complication and attached vitals from the moment of disruption. I read it in silence. This wasn't about HOA pettiness anymore. This was about clinical trauma, and I was holding it in my hands. I walked the summary up 2 floors to medical records. From there, I requested a certified, HIPAA-sealed version for external filing. The clerk didn't ask questions. I was within bounds. Downstairs, I passed through the staff elevator and cut across the south lot to the administrative wing. That's where the final piece fell into place. Outside the vendor entrance, I spotted the Mistwatch security vehicle. Still running, still inside hospital grounds. The driver stepped out, same guy who'd been there that night. Name tag, Keller. He didn't recognize me out of scrubs. Or maybe he didn't care. I walked past him, then paused. "You're HOA contracted, right?" I asked. "Glade Cross Summit," he said, a little too proudly. "We do perimeter patrols." "Interesting," I said, watching his face. "Your contract restricts patrols to HOA-maintained property. You aware that this is county medical land?" He blinked. "That's what I thought," I said. "You're trespassing." He started to speak, but I was already walking. Inside, I filed the last document, a risk event referral to the city's Emergency Services Compliance Review Board. It included footage from hospital security, scanned copies of the HOA notices, and Dr. Rennick's signed statement. If they accepted the referral, which I knew they would, Glade Cross Summit would receive an official inquiry notice. Their private security contract would be frozen for investigation, and if the city saw it fit, they could notify the HOA's insurance provider, flagging them for negligent operational exposure. It was the kind of pressure Verena couldn't charm her way out of. She'd fired the first shot in the name of aesthetic order. Now the state was about to fire back, in the name of emergency law. Elena didn't ask what I'd been doing. Not at first. She sat near the living room window, Lyra cradled against her chest, sunlight painting slow patterns over the blanket wrapped around them both. Her eyes tracked the wind in the trees, but her mind was elsewhere. I could see it in her stillness, the way she wasn't blinking enough, the way her breath caught just slightly between cycles. Her body had left the hospital. Her fear hadn't. She finally looked over. "How bad is it?" I sat across from her, elbows resting on my knees. "They escalated. 3rd violation. Threatening service suspension." She nodded slowly. "Plowing. Trash. Medcare." "Yeah." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "I thought we were safe here." The words crushed something inside me. Not because they were dramatic, because they were honest. This place, the clean sidewalks, the quiet nights, the view from the upstairs nursery, it was all supposed to be the opposite of chaos. I built my whole plan around that. Get Alina through the pregnancy, get Lyra here, keep them insulated. And now my wife was recovering from a stress-complicated delivery, while a neighborhood enforcement president decided whether she got road access in a snowstorm. "I won't let them touch us," I said. "Not through policy, not through fear. We're already in motion." She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. That afternoon, I finalized the formal complaint with the Department of Emergency Access Oversight, a newly formed but legally binding panel that audited suburban overreach related to emergency response. The system had been updated last year to include HOA entities in post-COVID emergency law reforms. The Reddings, the Ruiz family, the Grants on Ivy Loop who got cited for stopping a moving truck too close to a hydrant. 8 names, 8 stories, 8 cases of convenience turned into violations of neighborhood flow. I drafted a petition, not for removal, not for outrage, but for transparency. A demand for independent audit access, open policy sessions, and third-party review of all emergency-related violations for the past year. I didn't post it publicly. I sent it directly to those 8 families with a single message. If we let them keep the shadows, they'll weaponize the light. Within 12 hours, 5 signatures came back. 2 had already filed internal appeals. One neighbor replied with a phone number and the sentence, We've been waiting for someone to finally stand up to her. By the end of the weekend, the board would have more than a regulator problem. They'd have a community with receipts, and at the center of it all wasn't anger. It wasn't even vengeance. It was policy, with teeth. That night, as the lights dimmed across Glade Cross, I stood by the nursery window and looked down toward the trailhead near the emergency access boulder. It sat there in the dark, painted white and pristine, like it had always been above reproach. But now I'd seen what lay behind it, and soon everyone else would too. By Saturday morning, the first real fracture showed. The HOA app glitched. It wasn't subtle. The interface that usually displayed friendly reminders and flowerbed contests now showed a blank screen where the violation feed used to be. Residents noticed. A few posted in the neighborhood forum. One even joked, "Did Glade Cross forget how to scold us today?" I didn't respond. I knew what was happening. Mistwatch had pulled their data stream. When a security vendor severs live access, it doesn't just remove patrol logs. It disrupts every violation thread that piggybacks on real-time enforcement. And because Verena had centralized everything, surveillance, citations, committee notifications, she was suddenly flying blind. It was the first time the HOA had lost control of the tools it used to control everyone else. I spent that morning preparing for Monday. The Emergency Services Review Board had scheduled its preliminary hearing. Remote only, 30 minutes, but it was real. I organized the files, Reese's logs, video captures, scanned violations, compliance letters, everything indexed and ready. But I knew documents weren't enough. They needed context. That's why I called Dr. Rennick. We spoke briefly, off record. I asked if he'd be willing to submit a professional impact statement, not about Elena's specific labor case, but about the effect interference had on active medical response. His answer was immediate. "I already wrote it," he said. "You'll have it tonight." By the time I got off the call, another message had landed, this time from a neighbor I hadn't contacted. Mason Lohr, lives on Fernwell Ridge, retired EMT. I'd seen him walking with a brace on his knee, usually kept to himself. He wrote, "Heard what happened. I've got body cam footage from last year. Security harassed a visiting nurse during a lift assist. I wasn't going to do anything with it, but maybe you will." I met him that evening at the edge of his driveway. He didn't say much, just handed me a worn flash drive and nodded once. On the footage, you could hear the nurse's voice trembling. She was trying to explain that the stretcher couldn't make the angle of the driveway slope, that she had to park where she did. The security guard, one of Mistwatch's, kept citing clear path expectations. You could hear the patient coughing inside the house. It wasn't just cold, it was clinical cruelty. That clip became Exhibit 9. By Sunday, Reese sent me one last file, a full chain of internal votes from the board's closed session calendar. It showed something I hadn't expected. Verena had retroactively inserted emergency rule amendments without full board consensus. The votes had been marked assumed via standing policy, but no record of those approvals existed. That was enough for the audit team to file a procedural deviation claim, one that could trigger a bylaws breach if confirmed. At 10:42 p.m., I uploaded everything. The case folder was 218 megabytes. It included 12 separate exhibits, 3 sworn statements, and 1 6-minute video that ended with the slow fade-out of a stretcher being wheeled past an HOA security vehicle parked with its lights off. I named the file Glade Cross Summit Emergency Access Review Final. I didn't sleep that night, not from nerves, from clarity, because the trap was set. Not a trap of deception or vengeance, but of proof. Verena had built her power on a foundation of unchallenged authority, buried in technicalities, enforced through silence. But silence had left the building. So had her leverage. And Monday morning, she'd find out just how quickly control can vanish when it's built on manipulated code and bad faith. Just before dawn, I stood at the nursery window again. Lyra stirred in her sleep, tiny fist curling near her cheek. Elena whispered a lullaby from the hallway, just a faint hum carried over the hardwood. Outside, the emergency access stone gleamed under the first light, still there, still clean, still pretending to be neutral. But I knew the truth now. And in less than 24 hours, so would the state. The meeting started at 9 a.m. sharp. No waiting room, no warm greetings, just a flat digital interface and the muted tension of officials who didn't have time for anything but truth. I wore a collared shirt, didn't bother with a tie. Elena sat just off screen, Lyra cradled in her arms, silent but watching. It wasn't for support, it was for presence. I wanted to remember why this mattered. 3 officials from the Emergency Services Compliance Review Board sat on the other side. Their backgrounds were identical: a seal, a flag, a digital timestamp. The lead investigator, a woman named Riva Doran, introduced the hearing and motioned for me to begin. I didn't waste a word. I walked them through the incident first. The moment HOA security followed my vehicle to a hospital intake zone. The delay logged at 3 minutes, 47 seconds. The subsequent effect on Elena's breathing patterns. The OB-GYN's medical summary, citing stress-induced labor complication. Then I moved into the violations. I explained the original timestamp from Verina's doorbell camera, how the violation was issued before the event concluded, how she manipulated the location record to make a curbside loading moment look like a full obstruction. I showed them the logs Reese pulled, highlighting 8 other manipulated cases, including one resident whose access to emergency medtech aid was restricted based on a falsified pattern of obstruction. Then I played the body cam footage from Mason Lure. You could hear the nurse's voice crack as she pleaded with the guard to let her park without being cited. You could hear the coughs of the patient in the background. You could see the lights of the security vehicle flicker behind her as the nurse tried to stabilize an oxygen tank. The board didn't speak for a full 20 seconds after it ended. Then I dropped the final piece. The drive containing internal HOA vote logs, proof that Verina had bypassed full board procedure to enact rule changes, retroactively applied to emergency-related behavior, without recorded approvals. Glade Cross Summit is no longer managing safety, I said. It's punishing urgency, and they're doing it with systems designed to conceal, not protect. The session ended with a short deliberation period. I sat in silence. Elena squeezed my shoulder once, then stepped out of frame. When the board returned, Riva Doran looked directly into the lens. The panel has unanimously voted to escalate this to the municipal attorney's office for formal review, she said. We are also notifying the Office of Private Security Licensing for vendor conduct review and forwarding a copy to the State HOA Oversight Division for independent audit. Then she paused. You should also be aware. Your complaint triggered a flag with the HOA's insurer. They've frozen liability coverage pending investigation. That was it. Official, logged, unstoppable. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the first break in a dam. 3 hours later, Glade Cross Summit sent out its first emergency board-wide announcement in over a year. Emergency compliance notice. All enforcement actions are suspended pending legal review. All community privilege suspensions are halted. HOA President Verina Chalswick has taken a voluntary administrative leave effective immediately. Reese texted me the second it went live. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked down to the access boulder. It sat there, like it always had, bright white lettering against the dark stone. No stopping anytime, 24/7 enforced. No exemptions. I crouched next to it and ran my fingers along the edge. There, in the crack near the base, was a paint mark I hadn't noticed before. Faded, blue, from a stroller's wheel maybe, or a nurse's shoe. Not even stone can deny history forever. Behind me, a group of neighbors had gathered. Not a crowd, just a slow trickle. The Reddings, Mason. 2 people I didn't know by name. One woman stood silently with her arms folded, staring not at me, but at the stone. What happens now? Someone asked. I stood slowly. We don't let them repaint it again, I said. The boardroom smelled like fresh laminate and fear. Monday evening, the HOA called an emergency public session. Mandatory attendance, live streamed, with 2 uninvited guests, a representative from the municipal attorney's office and a quiet observer from Argent Guarantee, the HOA's insurance provider. Verina wasn't there. The room had changed since the last time I'd been inside it. The flags still stood. The chairs were the same, but something had shifted in the way people sat. Rigid backs, careful eyes, too much stillness. They weren't residents anymore. They were witnesses. Reese sat at the far end, jaw locked, clipboard resting in his lap. He didn't look at me when I entered. He didn't need to. He'd already done his part. I took a seat just behind the main aisle. The interim board chair, Ellen Dross, formerly secretary, called the meeting to order. Her voice trembled slightly as she read from the agenda. Tonight's session is focused solely on the findings presented to the HOA by the Emergency Services Compliance Review Board and the Municipal Legal Liaison's Office. She cleared her throat, adjusted her glasses. We have received notice that HOA security enforcement procedures may have contributed to unlawful interference with emergency medical access, including during a high-risk labor event involving a resident's family. We are cooperating fully with state and municipal authorities. Whispers rose around the room, not gasps, not outrage. The sound of people confirming what they already suspected. Next, the municipal rep stood, tall, silver hair, tablet in hand. No name given, just the weight of authority in his posture. Based on our review of the submitted materials, he said, the Glade Cross Summit HOA Board is under provisional audit. That includes review of enforcement records, internal amendments, security contracts, and resident complaint logs. He tapped the tablet once. In addition, we are issuing a hold on all existing fines and privileges suspensions pending this review's outcome. Any attempts to enforce HOA violation penalties during this hold may constitute administrative misconduct. That was the first real shift. A few board members stiffened. A murmur ran through the back row. And then he added one final line. We've also notified your insurance provider, who will make their own determinations regarding liability exposure. The Argent rep didn't speak, just nodded once, like a judge acknowledging a gavel drop. Ellen moved to the next item on the agenda, public comment. The microphone stand felt colder than it should have. I waited 3 speakers before standing. When I walked forward, a hush rolled through the room. Not everyone knew who I was, but enough did. My name is Callan Mirek, I said. My wife, Elena, went into labor 9 days ago. We were delayed getting into the hospital because HOA security followed us into an ER drop-off lane under the directive of this board's president. No one moved. She was cited for obstruction while having contractions. I received a violation letter while sitting beside her recovery bed. I paused, letting the weight of it settle. You can call it an error in judgment, a policy misunderstanding, a glitch in the system. But that system was built by people, voted on by people, and manipulated by one. I held up the printed report from the review board. This is what happens when rules become weapons, when neighborhood order gets enforced like doctrine, when you care more about curb paint than cardiac monitors. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to, because the silence in the room was already deafening. I stepped back and another neighbor took my place. Mason. Then the Reddings, then someone I didn't know, reading a violation letter she got while helping her father after his stroke. One after another. By the time the 10th speaker finished, there were no more policy lines to hide behind, only faces, and a stone marker outside waiting to be repainted. They removed the stone marker 3 days later. No announcement, no ceremony, just a maintenance truck and 2 men with a crowbar and dolly, working early in the morning while the air was still silver with mist. I watched from the porch, Lyra asleep against my chest, her head tucked under my chin. Alina stepped out beside me, steaming mug in hand, robe pulled tight. She didn't ask where they were taking it. She didn't need to. That rock had never been about safety. It had been about control, about obedience, about pretending every rule was sacred, even when it hurt the people it was supposed to protect. Now, it was gone. A week earlier, I'd stood at that very spot and stared at the word enforced like it was a threat. Now, it was a memory, disappearing down the road in the back of a county truck. In its place, a bench appeared, simple wood slats, black iron frame, no plaque, no logos, just one sentence, carved into the top rail. Urgency doesn't need permission. It didn't say who paid for it, but I recognized Reese's handwriting in the carving. Clean, precise, quiet. The HOA didn't fight the replacement. They didn't issue a new violation code. They didn't respond at all, because they couldn't. The audit board's ruling came in the night before, final, public, sealed with the city's letterhead. Verena Chalswick was formally barred from holding any HOA governance role within the state for 10 years. The board's enforcement system was deemed procedurally unsound. Mistwatch's contract was nullified. All fines issued under emergency access violations were invalidated and refunded. The neighborhood didn't cheer. No balloons, no posts with hashtags or backyard celebrations. Glade Cross wasn't built for spectacle. But something shifted. People waved more. They asked questions instead of filing reports. A few brought over food. One woman I barely knew handed Elena a hand-knitted baby blanket with a note that simply read, "Thank you for not moving." That was when I knew. We hadn't just won, we'd stayed. I stood at that bench a few days later, this time alone, just me and the breeze coming off the hill. There was no HOA surveillance now, no pings from the app, just silence. The kind I hadn't realized we'd lost until it came back. From behind I heard footsteps, familiar ones. Reese stood there, hands in his jacket, watching the same wind I was. "She's gone," he said. I nodded. Took a lot longer than it should have. He looked down at the bench. Took less than I thought it would. We sat. Neither of us spoke for a while. Eventually, he broke the quiet. "You planning to run?" I looked at him. "For the board?" "Why not?" I smiled, faintly. "Because I don't want to spend my life keeping people in line. I just wanted to make sure no one gets punished for showing up 5 minutes late to protect their family." He gave a slow nod. "Then maybe that's exactly why you should." Behind us, a stroller squeaked against the curve of the sidewalk. A father pushed it carefully, glancing at the bench with curiosity. His kid giggled under a fleece blanket, reaching toward the breeze like it was something new. I watched them until they turned the corner. "I'm not here to build a legacy," I said. "I'm just here to make sure my daughter can grow up without fearing the people in charge of the lawn paint." Reese stood. He didn't argue. We didn't shake hands either. That wasn't us. As he left, I stayed behind. Just me, the bench, and the street where it all happened. I thought about the first notice, the second one, the third, the hospital parking lot. The moment Alina screamed while security stood between us and the ER doors, and I thought about every person who said nothing until they finally did. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Because sometimes the smallest place on the street holds the loudest proof that silence was never safety. And now, finally, it's over. I knew. I'd helped draft the policy memo. I added the Mistwatch vehicle plate, the timestamp of their entry into hospital property, and the visual record of Keller entering the intake driveway, a restricted zone under city code. The moment that footage was matched with the internal report from Dr. Rennick and the nurse who filed the initial delay log, we'd meet the required criteria for an enforcement interference review. Once approved, the panel could trigger either a city citation or an insurance flag, depending on outcome severity. That night, I received the confirmation. My complaint had cleared intake and been assigned a compliance officer. 3 hours later, the HOA app went quiet. For the first time in weeks, no alerts. No camera-pinged reminders about curbs or lighting or pet waste stations. No policy warnings sent by Verina's hand. She was either prepping her defense or scrambling for one. I didn't celebrate. The thing about systems is, they rarely break when you push them hard. They break when they're already cracked and someone finally names the fracture. And Reese had done that. 2 days earlier, he'd sent me something else, a quiet signal that the ground was shifting. A spreadsheet attachment. HOA security reports from the past quarter, lightly anonymized but with enough metadata to identify patterns. There it was, 8 different emergency access violations, all within 20 feet of that same boulder. 6 of the 8 involved households with children, elderly residents, or medical support visits. Not a single report had escalation timestamps that aligned with the security vendor's GPS logs. Someone, almost certainly Verina, was time-skewing incidents to inflate non-compliance. And because the board hadn't opted into third-party transparency protocols for HOA governance, there were no external audits. No one to stop her, until now, because I'd triggered an external review. Because Reese had given me enough to show patterned enforcement abuse. Because Dr. Rennick had written a report that used the word interference 3 times. And because, for the first time since the stone marker was painted, someone had drawn a legal line around it. The next morning, a notice went out. Not to residents, not to the board, but to the Mistwatch contract administrator. A suspension of perimeter activities for Glade Cross Summit, pending municipal investigation. Effective immediately. By noon, the security vehicle was gone. By 2, Reese messaged me just 2 words, "She knows." I didn't reply, because by then, Verina Chalswick wasn't dealing with angry emails or appeals from neighbors. She was staring down a state panel with authority over insurance liability, emergency access codes, and operational governance. And I wasn't done. Reese didn't ask for a meeting. He just showed up at the pump station where I sometimes took Lyra for walks after midnight. It was the only part of Glade Cross Summit the HOA hadn't swallowed whole. Too close to the reservoir fence, too far from their curated walking trails. No cameras, no pet waste signage, just an old concrete slab and the sound of moving water. He walked up slow, his hoodie pulled low, eyes shadowed under the glow of the overhead lamplight. "I have something," he said. I didn't speak, just turned and waited. He handed me a drive. No label, just black plastic and a faint smear of dirt across the casing. "She made edits," he said. "Time manipulations, location shift logs. She's been retroactively changing when and where residents commit violations, then assigning pattern labels to justify escalation." "Is that all from the HOA system?" I asked. He nodded once. "I pulled it from the version control server backup. Most board members don't even know it exists, but I do. I helped set it up in year 1. I took the drive. What's on it? Full logs, original timestamps, security vendor access records, and an internal message chain where she instructed the vendor to trail your vehicle off property." I looked at him carefully. "And you're giving this to me now?" Reese exhaled. "Because I crossed my line." He rubbed the side of his neck, where a faded burn scar ran under his collar. "I used to think keeping order was the only thing that mattered," he said. "Keep it smooth, keep it quiet. Don't let things get messy." He paused. "But order isn't safety. And what happened to your wife? That wasn't smooth. That was violence done with a spreadsheet." His voice cracked then, just slightly. "I don't want to be a part of it anymore." I studied him for a beat. "You know this ends it for her." "I know," he said, "and I'm ready for that." We didn't say much after that. I thanked him, briefly. He nodded and turned away. No handshake, no ceremony. Just one man stepping away from silence, finally. At home, I reviewed the drive. It was worse than I expected. Not just my case, 8 others. All involving critical needs, oxygen delivery, wheelchair transfer, neonatal nurse check-ins. All labeled as pattern obstruction behavior after a single incident, then escalated to multi-tiered violation reports. Several of those residents had already paid fines. One had been denied clubhouse emergency elevator access during a storm because of non-compliance history. And in every case, the location data had been shifted, by seconds, by feet, just enough to make a drop-off look like a blockage, just enough to fabricate obstruction. It was systematic, it was targeted, and it was going to be her undoing. The next morning, I requested an emergency interview with the lead investigator assigned to the Emergency Services Compliance Review Board. I didn't lead with emotion. I led with Reese's data. The screen flickered to life. The man on the other end wore a badge around his neck, and the expression of someone used to hearing angry residents whine about water pressure or zoning lines. But halfway through my explanation, he sat forward. "These are falsified logs," I said. "They used them to restrict critical access." "And the vendor followed you onto hospital property?" "With permission," I replied. "Written and recorded." He didn't ask another question for 30 seconds. Then, "We'll be escalating this beyond standard municipal channels." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I knew what escalation meant in this context. The HOA wasn't going to face another community complaint or a quiet fine. This wasn't about a citation stuck to a mailbox or a parking reminder. This was now state-level investigation territory, where insurance providers get nervous and city attorneys start using words like public hazard liability. I ended the call and turned back toward the nursery. Lyra was asleep in Alina's arms, her breathing soft, the faintest trail of milk on her cheek. This time last week, that breath had almost been interrupted. Because one woman wanted a prettier neighborhood, because one HOA thought control meant safety. Now they were going to learn the difference. By the time Friday hit, Glade Cross Summit's serenity felt like it had a pulse. The usual rhythm of dog walkers and stroller moms had quieted. Neighbors paused longer at mailboxes, spoke in shorter sentences, and left porch lights on just a little later than usual. Not out of fear, out of awareness. Something was shifting. They felt it. They just didn't know where it started. But I did. That morning, I filed the last 2 documents that completed the enforcement triangle. The first was a formal request for contract review, submitted directly to Mistwatch Security's internal risk team. Thanks to Reese's logs, I had the precise timestamp and internal chat where Verena instructed Keller to tail a resident vehicle beyond HOA jurisdiction due to anticipated repeat behavior. It was phrased like policy. It read like pretext. That sentence alone violated 2 sections of Mistwatch's standing liability clauses: jurisdictional overreach and misuse of client authority. The second was a notification to Glade Cross's insurance provider, Argent Guarantee, an umbrella carrier that covered everything from sidewalk liability to board errors and omissions. It wasn't a lawsuit. Not yet. It was a liability exposure alert, a formal trigger under their community governance policy that forced the carrier to begin internal investigation or risk breach of duty to shareholders. It didn't accuse, it asked, "Did you authorize emergency medical interference by your insured party?" I knew what that would do. Carriers don't wait for lawsuits to knock. They run pre-litigation analysis algorithms that spit out 3 words no HOA ever wants to hear: risk not acceptable. It was slow, bureaucratic poison, but legal, clean, and real. And it started ticking the moment I hit send. Meanwhile, I prepared the evidence board, not a literal one, but the digital kind, labeled folders, time-sorted violations, Reese's full access logs with visual annotations. I color-coded the 8 manipulated cases and clipped the sections from the HOA bylaws that Verena had quietly altered through board subcommittees, rules that allowed enforcement to act preemptively, without vote, without witness. It wasn't just control, it was predation by policy. The centerpiece was the footage, Keller stepping out of his Mistwatch vehicle inside the hospital's red zone, not a foot beyond it. Inside. His badge was visible. The timestamp synced with hospital security. That alone connected the HOA's directive to a live medical scene. I prepped a clean handoff drive for the review board and made a duplicate for legal contingency. I didn't need to explain the context in words. The evidence spoke fluently in legal. All I needed was for them to see it, but I wasn't done. Because the final move, the one that would stick long after the reports faded, had to be community-facing, not a takedown, a reset. So I made the list.